My guest again is Barry Rubin. Welcome back, Barry. Barry, you've written lots about Iran, and Iran is the center of this Islamist front. Can you sum up the danger that Islam poses?
Well, Islam doesn't pose any
Islamism,
danger.
My mistake, Islamism.
Well, you have a revolutionary totalitarian philosophy which often preaches genocide against Jews, which hates the West, which wants to take over every country in the region, and at times, although it's a bit of a fantasy, the world, and create a very repressive government and treat women as second-class citizens. And I think, these things pose a problem which should disturb people. And also, of course, deeply involved in terrorism. Now, of course, I have to explain that Islamism is not a religion. Islamism is a political movement which has a religious aspect to it. But Islamism, like all revolutionary movements, wants to seize state power and use a plan, ideology, to transform all of society, like communism, like fascism, like Arab nationalism. That's what it's about. And therefore, these groups are seeking to overthrow governments in every country from Indonesia in the east to Morocco in the west. And of course, they're also active in other countries. Now, they don't always use violence and terrorism as a tactic, but what's important is not the tactic, it's the goal. Communism didn't always use violence either. In fact, used violence overall a lot less to seize control of countries than Islamism does. So it's the main threat in the modern world, and of course specifically the peoples of the Middle East. Now, I say peoples of the Middle East, I mean Turks and Palestinians and Egyptians and Jordanians, as well as Israelis, and of course in two areas, Iran and the Gaza Strip, people are living under such regimes, and they're very repressive regimes.
Well, why do you think the United States doesn't label Iran as the center of terrorism? It mentions it, of course, and focuses so much on Al-Qaeda.
Well, first of all, in the State Department annual reports, every year, they say that Iran is the major state sponsor of terrorism. But there are two answers. One answer is, of course, September 11th, that Al-Qaeda has more openly, directly attacked the U.S., and the second is that it's a much weaker and easier target. So, but we know, that Iran was involved in an attack on American personnel in the Khyber Towers. It was involved in attacks on American personnel elsewhere. A few days ago, the BBC, for example, had an interview with an American officer in Iraq. It's hardly the first, in which he says, we know that a lot of the training and the military equipment to attack Americans in Iraq comes from Iran. And this is not something new. So it's a deliberate avoidance because if they acknowledged it, then they might have to do something about it.
Well, let's take the trend. Well,
I'll tell you a quick story.
Your anecdote.
First of all, we know it's open that the Iraqi insurgents are mainly run by Al-Qaeda. We know that these people come across the border from Syria, where they get training and money and arms. So I appeared on a panel speaking with the former American ambassador to Syria. And he said, blah, 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 blah. And afterward, American government official came up to me and he said, not only the terrorists go from Syria into Iraq, but they leave, the bus that goes to the border leaves from the fairgrounds across the street from, and within sight of the U.S. Embassy, because they're sticking it to the U.S. and they're not acknowledging it. Now, in early 2010, when there were some major terrorist attacks in Iraq, the Iraqi government publicly said, we blame Syria, and asked the U.S. for support in demanding that Syria extradite the people who were organizing the terrorist attacks. And the U.S. and the Obama administration refused to do it.
Well, this is the other theme of this discussion has been the weakness of the White House in confronting the supporters of Islamism.
You know, I don't even want to use the word confronting, because confronting sounds like war. I mean, first of all, recognizing and then using all the tools of statecraft, you know, in order to deal with this. Again, I am not a big advocate of sending military forces. I was one of the first person to call for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, but because I believe that the regime could only stand on its own 2 feet if it had to. I'm in favor of except for people doing training and stuff, I'm in favor of withdrawal of Western troops from Afghanistan. So it's not a question of attacking people, but it is a question of you, first of all, acknowledging the problem, helping the moderates, being strong and credible, using diplomatic efforts, including sanctions, economic sanctions, and other pressures to mount a campaign, but not, you know, again, you don't have to go to war. But when you don't do anything or anything much or as little as possible, as late as possible, you're signaling weakness and you're telling the other side that they should move forward. And I mean, where do I get these ideas? Well, I mean, I quote Ahmadinejad, who just made this amazing statement saying, Iran has Syria, it's getting Turkey. He said, God willing, it will have Iraq. America is retreating. They're pulling out of Iraq. We are winning, you know, when we're going to triumph. Now, this is what he believes. This is what the Syrians believe, and it encourages people to fight. But let's look at the record.
Well, the record is one thing, but we have very little time, and I want to shift to the domestic side, because you have a significant opposition movement.
Well, that's a perfect example. That when the Iranian government stole the election openly and people went out in the streets, that Obama refused to support the opposition until he was virtually shamed into it. And on one occasion, the State Department briefing referred to Ahmadinejad as the elected leader of Iran. So why is this? And there's a number of reasons. One reason is because they believed that they were going to, not everybody in the administration, but they believed, the people who were setting policy, they would engage Iran, make a deal, and make it moderate. Number two, because they were out of date. Because as bad as the Iranian government was in 2008 or 2009, it became significantly worse in 2010 because the most extreme of the extreme people took over, and they didn't recognize it. Number three, because they basically didn't want to do anything. And number four, because they had this weird idea that it's like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. You have to have a lot to understand things. That if they endorse the opposition, everybody says, oh, well, they're Western backed. So, I mean, if you know anything about Iranian domestic politics, everybody always accuses everybody else of being a foreign agent. And in fact, even the very days when the Obama administration was refusing to support the opposition, every day the government was saying, oh, they're just American agents, the CIA organized the whole thing.
The last comment, I have to get in the nuclear issue. How critical is the nuclear issue?
It's incredibly critical, but in part for a different reason what people think. People are aware of the nuclear issue that Iran could attack Israel with nuclear weapons, and that's a very big and serious problem. But there's an additional problem, which is if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it will be taken as a huge success for the Islamist revolution in Iran, and tens of thousands of people will join Islamist groups. The level of violence and instability will go up in every state. Arab states will have to deal with appeasing Iran. It's a huge shift in the balance of power in the region against the West, against the moderates, and in favor of the revolutionary Islamists. That A, the West couldn't stop it, and B, the West is afraid of Iran. And again, you don't have to ask me. You know, you can ask Saudis or Jordanians or Lebanese or others. And of course, from the point of view of Arab-Israeli conflict, if Iran has nuclear weapons, nobody is going to do what they don't like. Forget about any more Arab-Israeli peace. It's a big plus for Hamas against the Palestinian Authority, and so it to some extent it places control of the West Bank in jeopardy because people in the West Bank are going to join Hamas, and that weakens the hold of the existing government. So it's a strategic disaster. Thank you.
that line. Thank you very much, Barry. Appreciate it.
Thank you.